All righty. Let's see. Am I on? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't want to be too loud. How's everybody doing? Ready for this? Ready. Yeah. I think I'm ready. Yeah, I'm ready. Yeah. I don't think I have any gossip for you. I was trying to think if I had any gossip. I don't think so. I was at a surprise birthday party for somebody this weekend, and there was a young woman there, that sister, the surprise person. And I had about a 45-minute conversation with her about interior design. And that was more of a surprise to me than the birthday thing. I was more surprised by that than the guy that had the surprise party. So how did I end up having... Anyway, there we go. So there's the only gossip I have. So we are ready for verse 49. Yeah, 49. Mark 14. Mark 14. Sorry, yeah. Well, I'll get us in from a good point, but we're really deeply into the Passion right now. The next, well, almost to the end, up to Jesus' death, which is almost at the end of chapter 15, is all of this stuff about what Jesus goes through. I've been really moved by this, by doing such a deep dive into these things. I think sometimes we get so used to the narrative of the story of the death of Jesus and the process that he went through that we forget how absolutely horrible it really was. And it's easy for us to just tell the story, talk the story through. And since I'm doing Good Friday and I'm actually talking about, they said I have 10 minutes. How do you talk about the death of Jesus in 10 minutes? Or how does Tim Ayers talk about the death of Jesus in 10? But yeah, it's just, I've been overwhelmed by it. And I think it's been good for me to be so deeply entrenched in the text as I've been preparing, because I'm way ahead in my prep. And then coming into Easter, thinking about this. I do understand the Orthodox process. Have any of you ever done the stages of the cross? Gone through and done the stages of the cross? You've done that, Bruce? Yeah. It's probably a good thing to go through it and just recognize that each one of those stages represents a moment in a very short period of time in Jesus' life as he comes to the end of his life, and each one is equally horrible. So anyway. Well, let me pray for us and we'll get going here. Lord, thank you for this time, for these folk that would come out tonight, and make sure that your name and your Son are glorified in this time. Thank you for giving us your word, and that it is so alive and speaks to us at so many different levels. I thank you for that, Lord, and I pray that our time will honor you. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I'll start. Now, we've just had where the Judas has come and kissed Jesus. We talked about that last week. And then he was grabbed and arrested. And then we went through the business of this cutting off of a hunk of a person's ear. And then we read this, and Jesus asked him, "I some dangerous revolutionary that you've come with swords and clubs to arrest me? Why didn't you arrest me in the temple? I was there among you teaching every day, but these things are happening to fulfill what the scriptures say about me." Then all of his disciples deserted him and ran away. One young man following behind was clothed only in a long linen shirt. And when a mob tried to grab him, he slipped out of his shirt and ran away naked. Okay, let's just stop there, because the next thing that we go into is the first part of the Jesus before Caiaphas, or before the Sanhedrin, and that's a shift. And as I said last week, if you recall, that Mark goes back and forth between one thing and another. And one of the things is Peter's denial, and it just keeps going back and forth. And really, that next section is a new hunk. So we'll just start right there. And when Jesus says, "Am I some dangerous revolutionary?" That word, as I said last week, is really robber, and it's the same exact word in the Greek. It's lysstein is the word lysstein, and lysstein is a word that is also used for the two men who are crucified with Jesus. And so it's like the same thing. He's being treated in the same manner and named in the same manner as he says that. He said, "Did you come with swords and clubs?" And then he goes, "Why didn't you arrest me in the temple?" He said, "I was there teaching, I was there among you teaching every day." And when he says, in the Greek it says daily, I was there teaching daily. This is a bit of an odd thing for Mark to say, have Jesus say, and I'm sure Jesus said it, but the thing is that Mark has only given us a week of Jesus teaching in Jerusalem. He's only really given us a couple of days, and so he's either saying, I was there the last couple of days to teach you this, or as John shows us, that Jesus went to the temple a bunch of other times. It's like he'd been there teaching other times, and so Jesus is saying that you could have heard me. And his point is, these guys that have come to get him are the guards who keep order at the temple. And they certainly, when Jesus was there, I'm sure were standing nearby to make sure that he didn't raise a ruckus, because Jesus' presence was already enough of a problem. He came into town, remember, he came into town like he was the new king. And so, yeah, I'm sure they had heard him daily, and that meant that they would have had, actually the Greek word that gives us daily means many times. Many times. This sentence, by the way, can be read two ways. As you know, Greek has no punctuation. And so we have to decide whether it's a question or a declarative sentence. It could be read, he said, essentially, why didn't you arrest me in the temple? I was there every day. Or he could be saying, I was there every day. And you could have arrested me. That's just the way you want to state it, because the language doesn't really tell us one or the other. But you know what? They're both true. They're both true, whether it's a question or a declarative sentence. He had been there teaching, and there would have been ample opportunity for his things he was saying to get him arrested. We have to remember that the only reason you could arrest anybody in their world, and we'll get to this later when we get to the court case, but the only reason that you could arrest someone under Jewish religious law was if they blasphemed. Now, blasphemy, I read the longest, and in the notes I make a note of this for you, but I read the longest article on the history of the vagaries of what the Jews considered blasphemy to be, because it changed over time, and it got worse at some times and stronger, less strict and all that. About now, pretty much what blasphemy was to the Jews was that you either said something terribly offensive about God himself, or you encouraged people to worship an idol. And Jesus is just saying, if you were going to arrest me, I probably said that, something that you would have figured was wrong before, and nobody made a move. So what's the point? Why are you doing this? And actually, we're going to find that the leadership have to find something to arrest him for later. They have to find something because he hasn't done anything. Remember, there's no crime in declaring yourself the Messiah. There's no crime in that. Lots of people had declared themselves to be the Messiah. And there was no particular teaching that Jesus was giving other than if it was offensive to the other leadership. Like he says, they say this, but I say this, or you got to watch out for these guys. That's not blasphemy. It just makes them mad. And so they've got to find something that not only will pass the blasphemy sniff test, if you will, but it's also got to be something that the Romans will say is something we can kill him over. Because what's going to happen is that they're going to take him to get judged by the Jews, the Jewish council. And for the Romans, there's not much that comes out of the Jewish council that's worthy of killing somebody. And so this is all, Jesus is like, you had to sneak in at night like this, like I was a robber, to arrest me, when you could have arrested me right after I said something and had your witnesses. And so and this is all going to really come out when we get to the court case. But, Jesus says, I feel his. Now, sometimes people give this when you hear this read or something, they'll go, I was there among you. And he's like, and Jesus is worked up. I don't think so. I think this is a resignation sort of statement. Why would you do this now like this? I was there with you so often. You could have done this to me at another time. Well, you knew why they didn't do it in the temple, because if they'd arrested him in the temple, the people would have gone crazy. And he understood that. But the next statement is something that people have tried to figure out what he's talking about when he says, but these things are happening to fulfill what the scriptures say about me. I'll get to what the different scriptures could possibly be. Mark does not tell us what Jesus was talking about there. I think this is a very strong statement of resignation for Jesus. He's going, okay. He's not even talking to them. He's talking to himself. Because he has resigned himself to allowing what is about to happen. And now it's begun. And it's begun by the kiss from Judas, the betrayal, and the hard arrest. And he's like, okay, this has to happen because what? The scripture said this about me. Now let me look in my notes because I want to give them to you exactly. Now, some scholars think that this is Jesus is thinking of Zechariah 13:7. Is this guy on top of it or what? Jeff, thank you, Jeff. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, the man who is my partner, says the Lord of heaven's armies. Strike down the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered, and I will turn against the lambs. Now, that's not a very fun passage, but the point is that some people think that Jesus is talking about this passage because it's what will happen soon, which is the next verse says what? And they all left him. So you strike the shepherd, and the sheep scatter. Some people think Jesus was talking about that verse, or that was in his mind when he said. But then there are other people who say it could be Isaiah 53:12, where it says, I will give him the honors of a victorious soldier because he exposed himself to death. He was counted among the rebels. He bore the sins of many and interceded for rebels. Is that NLT? It must be, yeah. The rebels the word is actually, it's more like a transgressor or somebody who does something wrong. But this one is closer to he was counted among the transgressors, or he's just said, why are you treating me like a robber? This one's close to it. This one would be like what just happened to me. The scriptures are being fulfilled by what just happened to me. My thought is that this is a sorrowful aside that Peter heard him say, and Jesus never came back to it at any other time. He said it at the moment. Can you imagine? Jesus gets arrested roughly. He's about to be he's going to be drug off. And he goes, and this happened because the scriptures need to be fulfilled. And that's the end of his statement. And you can just feel the pathos in his soul. Because remember earlier, he wanted it all to be taken away from him. He wanted it to be taken away from him. And what he wanted taken away from him was what he knew the scriptures had said would have to happen to him. He understood it in a way that we can't read his mind. I think Jesus was capable of thinking multiple scriptures at the same time, probably, and so maybe it could be all of this and more. But I think it's a really sad moment in the life of Jesus. Because think about it, if it's the first one, he knows that everybody's going to desert him. And if it's the second one, he knows that though he has lived a life that has lived up to every aspect of human being, if you will, that was exactly what God expected from us as human beings. He'd lived that life. Now, we always say he lived a perfect life. I think that's true in some sense, but we mean perfect. When we say perfect, it doesn't mean that he did not sin. He didn't miss the mark, because the word hamartia, the word that gives us sin, simply means to miss the mark. And Jesus continually hit the mark. It's an arrow firing thing. And so Jesus lives this life that hits exactly the mark that what God wanted from humanity when he first created us. Jesus does it. And then he gets what? Counted among the transgressors. For no reason other than that he's apparently offended people who are continually transgressing. And I just can't even imagine what that was like for him in that moment. I don't know if you've ever been falsely accused. I've never been falsely accused at a level where I knew that people were going to kill me. But I've been falsely accused. For some reason, I was at a thing one time, and I didn't speak to hardly anybody. And the next day, Dave Rod got right up in my grill and said, "Don't you ever say that again about such and such and such and such." I was like, I didn't say anything like that. And there was like 40 witnesses there, and I said, "Where'd you hear that?" And he goes, "Well, so-and-so said it." And so I went to that person and I said, "Why'd you say I said this?" And they said, "I will not talk to you about this." And so I never told Dave Rod that I didn't say it. I just let him carry on he still believes I said it, I don't care. But that's about the closest I've ever come to being numbered with the transgressors. Because if I'd have said it, they should have fired me. But probably just telling you that story could get me fired. But unfortunately, he's retired. So, but anyway, it just is a sad moment for me, because it's not. This is the condition of his soul as he goes into the horrible things that are about to happen to him. It's like there's already torn in his soul over what's coming, and yet what comes is mostly physical from here on out. The next verse, "Then all his disciples deserted him and ran away," is really short in the Greek. It is just bang, bang, bang. Literally, "and leaving him, they fled all." And in the Greek, all is at the end of the sentence to emphasize that everybody ran away. Now, we don't know how, we know the 12 were with him, but we don't know how many other people were with him. This is an interesting moment. There is one guy, at the end of this passage where we have to talk about the one guy that ends up with his robe torn off. And we got to talk about that because it's a weird verse and it's not in any other text. It's in the good copies of Mark. Later, some of them left it out because, you get later texts where they leave the verse out because they don't want to talk about somebody being naked. Because nobody's supposed to be naked in the Bible. So anyway, but this is in the good texts. And it says the mob, or not really the mob, those gatherers, what it says, they go after him. But the truth is that the disciples are almost meaningless in this moment because they don't chase them down because it doesn't matter. They're not important enough. The only two people that are important enough would be, and we'll talk about this at length in a minute, would be if his brother was there, and we have no proof that his brother was there because when most former Messiah claimants were killed, people started asking one of their brothers if they were the brother stepped into the void of the movement. Does that make sense? But we don't have any proof that James was involved with Jesus at all until sometime after the resurrection. And there is the possibility that they'd have been interested in John because John apparently had a relationship with the high priest. And that could be useful in some manner to get him as a witness, or to force him to be a witness against Jesus. But when it says then they all, was that, can you put that back up, that Greek thing back up, or the raw Greek again? And leaving him, they fled all. It doesn't say the disciples, it just says everybody left him. The soldiers didn't care about those people because they know what their intentions are is to kill Jesus. And they know once he's dead, this whole thing's going to fall apart. That's really what happened. I talked about that before, didn't I? Did I talk about that? That there's only really one instance that I can think of that Josephus tells us about where anybody who was a Messiah claimant, that they killed off like all of their followers. They killed off a bunch of the people that followed this Messiah. And that was one where the Romans said, we're going to give you permission to go down by the Jordan and have a big gathering down there. And so the guy that they thought was the Messiah went down by the Jordan, and he brought about, thousands, a lot of people with him, and they all went down by the Jordan. And so they were against the river, and then the Romans all came in back behind them and killed them all. But most of the time, they just would kill the person who was thought to be the Messiah, and the whole thing would fall apart. And in fact, if you guys, I don't know if you heard me this weekend, some of you may have heard me this weekend, but I said that the disciples had decided already once Jesus had died that they had been wrong about Jesus, and they were certain that this was a mistake. And you can feel it in the thing that those two on the road to Emmaus say, we thought he was the Messiah, but he's been killed. And it's like, we're done. Yeah. So anyway, they all flee, and nobody does anything about them because they don't care. They got Jesus, and that's the only thing. Now, clearly they thought that there was going to be some kickback from the followers of Jesus. They wouldn't have brought all these guys with swords and clubs, and then they see them all run away. His main dudes, they all just hit it and disappear into the darkness, and they don't care. They didn't need to chase him down because they had the one dude they had Jesus. That's all that mattered. I think this too, this is this, strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. This had to break Jesus' heart too. He's suddenly alone. When we get into the trial, we'll see how the things work. And you talk about being exposed, and there's nobody there at all. and some of them he spent 3 years with every day for 3 years with them. And so, yeah, I just find this sad. I don't think, let's see. Yeah, you'll see in the notes that there's not a shift. You know, they're all thinking, we don't need to worry about these guys because tomorrow they're not going to care about any of this anymore. They're going to be running for their lives. And so we got Jesus and we'll take care of it. But then we have this next verse. It says, one young man following behind was clothed only in a long linen shirt. Now, can I just say, however Mark got this, he had to hear that this guy, now, the long linen shirt is the tunic that is worn underneath your outer robe. Everybody wore, well, they wore some kind of like an underwear kind of thing, sort of gird up their loins. Have you heard that phrase before? And then they have, though girding your loins does not have anything to do with the things that it has to do with pulling your robe up and tying it up here so you can move your legs around faster. But they wore this outer thing, this linen thing, and then they would wear that robe over the top. If this young man, he was following behind, meaning he'd come to see what was going on. Now, he could have been somebody who followed Jesus, and he was there camping out, because we don't know how many people were camped out with him, because this was, Passover, and lots of people were camped out on the Mount of Olives and we don't know how many people were in the Garden of Gethsemane, but that could have, he could have just been camped there. He could have been one of them and he was sleeping there with him, or he was there with him, or he could have just been somebody that was off to the side and heard the commotion or something like that. We don't know. We don't know anything about it. But here's the problem we have. When it says long linen robe, this tunic, it's exactly the same language as is used for what they wrapped Jesus' body in. Okay? Now, just hang on to that for a minute. And where it says young man, it's the exact same Greek words that are used to describe the angels who are at the tomb. Okay? It's a different way to describe them. So, since we don't know exactly who this is or what this is about, the speculation on what this verse is about is massive. Like some people say, well, this was an angel who was there, who was watching over Jesus. Or some people say this is actually a pre-enactment of Jesus' burial. And it just goes on and on and on. Oh, yeah, and then here are the people that people say that it could be. When it says one young man, it could be John the disciple, because it says they went after him to grab him. And John was apparently familiar with the high priest, and so they would have had a reason to go after him. But somebody would have to point out that that's him. That guy knows the high priest. Now, maybe Judas could have done that. I don't know. But I don't think he ran away going, I know the high priest. You don't mess with me. No, I know the high priest. I don't think he did that. Then again, the brother of Jesus. It would have made sense that they might track down the brother of Jesus. But how would they know that James was the brother of Jesus? These guys are the temple guards. They don't know this crowd. They had to have somebody point out Jesus to them, for heaven's sakes. How are they going to know which one is his brother? Then John Mark, that's the guy that wrote the book. It could be him, because he seems to know a lot about what happened to this guy. And then it could be an anonymous person who just happened to be up on the thing, and somebody saw it happen, and they told Mark about it, and they said, you wouldn't believe it. There's a guy up there now the reason he's only in his tunic, I didn't tell you about that, is because he'd been asleep. When they went to bed, they took their outer robe off, which was really thick and heavy, and they used it as a blanket. And so what happened was he heard what was going on. He was asleep. He was in his pajamas. They didn't have pajamas. they just slept in their underrobe until they wore out. Can you imagine if we all wore the same robe and the same tunic until it wore out? But anyway, so he's in his tunic. He wakes up, hears a noise, goes over there, and then somebody tries to chase him down. Anyway, and it could have just been anybody, or it could have been an angel, because it was... Now, if it was an angel, I'm just thinking he'd have had a different response than running away naked. Or a symbol for Christians broadly, because the thing about Christians broadly as a symbol has to do with this. It has to do with you say you're going to give everything to Jesus, and then when things get hard, you run away with nothing but shame. When you don't stand firm, you run away from the circumstances with nothing but shame. Nakedness was terrible in their world. Nakedness was a really, really huge issue. You didn't want to be naked. I mean, they had things about not showing the ankles of the priests. We still have a bit of the nakedness. I mean, I'm showing more skin right now than they would have allowed. And nakedness was just a hugely shameful thing. So for this person to write that there was a young man, can you put that scripture back up? Yeah. That a young man following behind was clothed only in a long linen shirt. Now, anybody reading this in the first century would have gone, well, he was asleep. And then it goes, and the mob, that's not actually in the text, but they tried to grab him, he slipped out of his shirt. I mean, in other words, they grabbed him and it ripped off, and he ran away naked. What a story. But we don't have any idea what it's about, like who it was or anything. My bet, I know this is silly, but I used to teach a class on Mark and just assumed this was Mark and that he was a young man. And so I was saying that this was a gospel from a young man's perspective. I was completely wrong, but I taught it to young people and they dug it. I mean, I'd come to find out that it's a gospel from Peter's perspective and not Mark's. But I think it was Mark. Let's put him into context. His mother owned the upper room. Okay? His mother owned the upper room. And so a house with a big enough room upstairs to feed all those people, to sit around to have a meal in the upstairs, because almost no houses had the second floors. Yet this house had a second floor with a banquet hall in it. And so they must have been rich, which also meant that Mark, living in Jerusalem, lives in Jerusalem in a big house, and his mother is close enough to Jesus that he comes there and does stuff at the house. And so Mark would have a really good reason as a young man to be hanging out with Jesus. I'm sure every time Jesus came to Jerusalem or anywhere near, Mark got to go hang out with Jesus. Mark also was not going to name who got left naked, because it's such an embarrassment to have this happen, but he just couldn't let this moment pass. This is my thinking. I was there. I was asleep. I got up because I heard the commotion, and I went over there to see what was going on. And I'll be darned if somebody didn't come after me and grab me and they ripped my pajamas off and I had to run away naked, and I don't even want to talk about what happened after I got left naked on the... Now, he could have gone back to where he was sleeping and gotten his robe, but he still would have had to run away naked for some period of time. And that in and of itself would have been enough to be an embarrassment. And the last thing he wants to be known as is Mark, the author of the book, who ran away naked. He just wanted to make sure that he got that down because he was there and and this happened to him. Does that make sense? I don't think it's John. I don't think it's Jesus' brother. I don't think it was an angel. You would not believe the arguments that are out there amongst people about who it is, because they want to turn this moment into something spiritual. They want to use it as a metaphor. I find most of this stuff to be very medieval, that they want to make it something that it's not. Everything has to say something spiritual about the existential nature of what God is doing in the world, and it's not the case. It's just that I suppose if I got my pajamas ripped off in a moment like this, I probably wouldn't want you to know it was me, but I might tell you that there was somebody who did get his pajamas ripped off. Does that make sense? Now, we can argue about it. They do. I don't feel it's that important. It certainly doesn't. The interesting ones are the medieval Catholic ideas about this. There's one that says this is a story of people in preparation for baptism. I'm like, I cannot explain that to you because they did not explain it in their statement. But his name is Harrington. He's the guy that wrote the book that says that in his commentary. It's in the Sacra Pagina. The notes it's in the notes. But I can't explain it. But I just find it funny. Unless it's like when we are about to become baptized. Most baptisms at the time were of infants. And so you're naked and baptized and into the church. And this is just a picture of the beginning of the way the church is, because the bottom line is, though, that this is somebody who had committed himself to Jesus, and his refusal to go with Jesus leaves him with nothing but, and I said it earlier, shame. And this is not shame from being naked. This is shame from being exposed as someone who would not stand with Jesus in a difficult moment. Now, nobody else stood with him. But that's what this tells us. This is about all that tells me spiritually. Is that good? So I don't have anybody who wants to argue with me about the Mark thing? Okay, all right. This is one of those issues where I'd love to be in some kind of debate about this, and I get to take whatever position I want. Because I think you can argue all of them absurdum, but this is one of those verses where you wonder, what was the Holy Spirit thinking? Anyway, we'll take a break because we're right at the end. We're going to shift stuff. We're at the end of this, so yeah, let's take 5 minutes and we'll come back and we'll jump into the next hunk. Okay. Now, we are, oh, wait, is this? Oh, that's that picture of the kiss of Jesus, Judas. Judas has a receding hairline in that, doesn't he?
That's why he was mad.
Yeah.
There were two Judases, by the way. There were two Judas. Judas Iscariot was the only non-Galilean, which is an interesting thing. And so everybody else was a Galilean, and he's not. Which made him, because Iscariot was a Judean city, and it made him probably, it's like saying, I'm from Raleigh, and the rest of you's from Mayberry. If you get my point. So anyway. And he didn't want to be embarrassed. He didn't want to be embarrassed, and Jesus just embarrassed him to death over a woman at a banquet. So we're going to make sure this guy pays. I've been thinking a lot about this. I mean, Judas is never mentioned again in this story. He doesn't come up at all because he's not important anymore. Because everything we don't need to know what happened to Judas. I mean, we hear it in other Gospels. But it's clear that Judas did not expect them to take Jesus away and kill him. They just thought they'd take him away and embarrass him. And because that's what Jesus had done to him. And so he's getting back at it. And I just find that really interesting. I want to talk about that at some level when I do Good Friday, but I only have 10 minutes. So, so it's because it's a convoluted, it's a long, convoluted thing. And most people think that Judas did this out of greed. He didn't need the money. He needed his reputation restored. Or at least he needed to feel like, and remember, this is a revenge culture. It's a shame-based culture, and he needed to get revenge to bring back his own honor. And even though he'd been with Jesus for 3 years, Jesus had just really done it to him. And he's just not going to have it. So, anyway. That makes it a lot easier for us to relate to who Judas is. Because it's like, how could he possibly have done this? And and they talk about him being greedy and cheating with the money, but that 30 pieces of silver was the price of half a slave. There's not enough money to change anything. It wasn't like he was going to get to retire. And but I can understand how I do it. I don't know if you've ever been offended at a level where you just cannot believe that they've offended you in this manner publicly. And the things you think of you could do. I'm being confessional, I suppose. But Judas thinks, he's causing a stink. I know that these guys are trying to figure out what to do with him. Well, we'll just let him rough him up a little bit. We'll just tell him who he is. And then he's shocked at what happens. And he kills himself. Yeah. Yeah, he didn't expect it any more than anybody else. All righty. There's an ant running around my table up here. How he made it through, I don't want to kill you, you made it through the winter somehow. Get off the table. There you go. Okay. Verse 53. They took Jesus, this is the guards, to the high priest's home where the leading priests, the elders, and the teachers of the religious law had gathered. Meanwhile, Peter followed him at a distance and went right into the high priest's courtyard, where he sat with the guards, warming himself by the fire. Inside, the leading priests and the entire high council were trying to find evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. But they couldn't find any, Many false witnesses spoke against him, but they contradicted each other. Finally, some men stood up and gave this false testimony. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without human hands. But even then they couldn't get the story straight. Then the high priest stood up before the others and asked Jesus, well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself? But Jesus was silent and made no reply. Then the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothing to show his horror and said, why do we need other witnesses? You have all heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict? Guilty, they all cried. He deserves to die. Then some of them began to spit at him, and they blindfolded him and beat him with their fists. Prophesy to us, they jeered, and the guards slapped him as they took him away. I just want to say there's a lot going on in this passage. I understand the NLT's translation here, but we're going to have to get into some stuff that makes this even more deeper issues. But it says, this is going to be an account of Jesus' trial before the Jewish authorities. Later, he's going to give us an account of Jesus before the Roman officials as well. All four Gospels give us an account of this stuff, and they differ enough to make it difficult to put it fully together exactly what happened that night and the next morning, but this shouldn't be an impediment to seeing these events as true. I will say that each author had different sources. They thought about these things in different ways. They had different purposes in their Gospels, and so they put together their telling of the trial with the bigger ideas that they have in mind. And again, as I've said so many times in this class, and I think I actually said it in one of the week's sermons this weekend, that having the texts be different is good because it shows us that nobody's messed with the texts. Mark has Jesus taken immediately to the high priest. Some translations say the high priest's house, though house is not in the text. It just says they took him to the high priest. Now, I want you to know that in another gospel it says that they first took him to Annas, who was the high priest. Caiaphas, who is the high priest we're talking about here, is the son-in-law of Annas. Annas was removed from the high priesthood by the Romans. The average tenure of a high priest was about 4 years. It's just what it worked out. And it was generally that and to be the high priest, you had to be a Sadducee, and you had to be a member of one of 7 families. And this is the highest position in the Jewish religious system. The council that they're talking about is called the Sanhedrin, and it is made up of 70 men who sat when they met together, they sat in this semicircle thing. There you go. That's exactly right. That's exactly it. And you see where the high priest sits? And he's the one who oversees the ongoing discussions and things like that. Now, this does not tell us that this was the group that met like this. This does not tell us that. We don't know that they weren't for sure, but it feels like they go to the house of the high priest, the home of the high priest, because they speak about Peter being in the courtyard of the high priest. Every secular description of the high priest's home uses the word palace. Okay? Doesn't use it here, but it is in every secular description, it's palace. And so the high priest lived in a pretty great place, a pretty nice house. Annas was removed. Caiaphas was put in his place. He's the son-in-law, so there's like the same family there, and he would have definitely, Caiaphas or Annas would have married his daughter to somebody in a wealthy family. Caiaphas apparently was a really good administrator, and he got along with the Romans really well because he served for 19 years. And that's way, way longer than most ever did serve. But they take Jesus to this. Oh, by the way, it's when it starts talking about all the people and everything like that, if they're in the high priest's home, in a space in his home, they only need 23 people, 23 members of the 70-member Sanhedrin organization to have a quorum. So if they got 23, they can do their business. Does this make sense? They only need 23. So they might be in his house in a big room where 23 guys can stand around, but they probably form themselves in the same kind of space. There was a place in the temple, and here's a map over here. You see where that red thing is over there? It was called the Chamber of Hewn Stone, is what it was called, and that's where the Sanhedrin met in official business. And their official business was always to make decisions about religious law. Religious law. And so they were dealing with a lot of things between people and stuff like that were related to the Old Testament law. In this case, if they were to decide that Jesus needed to be killed, they cannot kill him. The Romans kept capital punishment close to the vest. They wanted to be able to put people to death. Only the Romans. They did not want the Jews to have the right to put people to death. Now, the Jews did have some means. If they really wanted to kill somebody, they had some backhanded ways. Remember, Jerusalem is on a cliff. It wasn't unusual. Have I talked about this before, that they'd throw people off that cliff, and then they'd pay Gentiles to throw stones at them if they lived through the fall? And then once they were stoned by the Gentile, then they'd all throw stones on them to bury them. You know, they have like a grave there with stones all over them because you didn't want to bury that person you didn't want to really bury him, but they wanted to cover him up. They had their ways of killing people if they needed to, but they didn't do that very often. Because most of the time, the Romans were keeping their eye on what these guys were up to. As I said before, the high priest is given the permission to do this work because the Romans say he can. And if the high priest gets out, but this is interesting, related to this, do you know in the Old Testament where they describe the amazing robe that with the jewels and all this stuff, this magnificent thing, that the piece of clothing that the high priest wears, he could only put that on when the Romans told him he could. He's not allowed to wear that normally. The Romans said, okay, this is a high day and you're being a good guy, we'll let you wear that robe. And then they'd bring it out and he'd put it on. So when he tears his robe, don't think he's tearing the big fancy one. He's tearing something else. Anyway, it's just interesting how much power they seem to have and how little power they actually have. And this has infuriated the Jews. You can imagine how they felt about the fact. And this is the reason in the other gospel, where do they take Jesus first? To Annas. Why? Because they're still recognizing him as a person who should be the high priest. And then he goes, you got to take him to my son-in-law Caiaphas. So anyway, and this is all, I mean, each guy tells a story a little differently. And you want to know who his audience is. But it says they took him to the high priest. It doesn't say home. It says they took him to the high priest, where the leading priests. Now, that thing about leading priests, or high priests, it's just plural, high priests. And I think I mentioned this last week, that when that same list was in another place, and that word actually tends to mean people who used to be the high priest. And they think there were 6 of them living at the time when this happened. So there could have been 6 former high priests in this gathering. And then the elders, those are the wealthy older men who own all the land. And then the scribes. And they'd gathered, and this is just the Sanhedrin. This is a makeup of the Sanhedrin, this council of 70 guys. But this is not important to the whole story because meanwhile, by the way, is not in the text. But meanwhile is okay by me. It says, and Peter followed him at a distance. Now, do you remember when Peter earlier said, I'm not going to leave you under any circumstances? Even if everybody else deserts you, I'm going to stay with you. Well, he's kind of half right. He's kind of half right. Now, we know from another gospel that because John knew the high priest, he got Peter in there. Mark does not talk about that. Probably because when Peter tells a story, he doesn't want to have to tell people that John got him in there, okay? Because he and John have this ongoing thing. But Peter followed at a distance. That's exactly what it says, at a distance. But he goes right to the center. He goes right into the courtyard. And you know how the houses were built with a center, an uncovered middle section. And he gets right into the courtyard of the high priest. That's pretty brave. That's pretty brave. Now, there's all kinds of speculation as to why he followed and went there. Some people say that he had a plan to try to get Jesus free. Maybe. I don't know. Some people say that he wanted to just see what happened. He was just concerned. I'd probably think it's the latter. I can't imagine that he went in there with a plan to free Jesus. I mean, he didn't do anything after this point later where it shows that he had any intention to do anything. I mean, he wouldn't admit he knew Jesus. And that couldn't possibly have simply been part of his plot to get Jesus free. You know? But he's right in the center of the house. And says, there he sat with the guards. Okay, the same word, guards, are the people who what? Arrested Jesus. So he's sitting there with them. He clearly is not afraid that they're going to recognize him by looking at him. And this is an interesting thing, it says, warming himself by the fire. The word for fire is here, it's a word of a big fire, a bright fire. Fire was used for two purposes in this kind of a space. One would be to be warmed. Remember, it's this time of the year, it's this time of it's early spring. We're at a high elevation. It's going to be cold, and so people are going to warm themselves by the. It's very late at night, too. But the other reason they used fire was because that was the only way they had to see anything. And so they used fire as a means to see what was going on. That's how people recognize him a bit. And they really know that he's one of them when they hear him talk because of his accent. But we'll get to that later. But he's right in there, if for no other, you got to give him some credit. He's halfway. Nobody else was there, or nobody else, the disciples came with him into that space. So this is him, this is the sandwiching of the two stories. So now we've got Jesus is in front of the high priest and other members of the Sanhedrin, and Peter's outside. And we're going to go back and forth on these stories the whole time. Okay. Meanwhile's fine, but that's not a word, meanwhile, in Greek. So anyway. So next, can you put the next verses up? Or it says, what's the next verse, Jeff? Okay. Inside, okay. The leading priests and the entire high council were trying to find evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. Okay. Evidence against Jesus is really important. The way things worked was if they arrested somebody, they tried to have the trial immediately. And then they wanted to do the punishment immediately. They did not have jails where they held people for crimes, okay? They didn't plan on somebody being in a prison for like 5 years for something that they did wrong. No, the punishments were quick and dirty, and they tried to get them done really fast. The Bible is really clear in the Old Testament that you can't convict anybody of a crime unless you have two witnesses. And the two witnesses, their stories have to be identical. And the way that they went about it was that they would have, and you saw that one picture that Jeff had up there where that showed what, can you put that map up there again of the, is that possible to get back to that, Jeff? Of the Sanhedrin with the person that was accused? Okay, you see where the accused is? The witnesses were brought in one at a time. One at a time. And they stood right up next to the accused. And they declared what they'd witnessed. A witness, an eyewitness to anything, was the most trustworthy source of information about what people did in the ancient world. Now, we don't feel that way anymore because we know that people's testimonies can be complete. An eyewitness, we know that 3 people standing on 3 different corners see an accident and their stories are completely different. Just because you're an eyewitness doesn't necessarily mean you got the story straight. But in their world, it was eyewitnesses, eyewitnesses, eyewitnesses. And you had to have at least 2 people whose stories in detail were identical. And they could not be together in the same space when they gave their stories. Okay? And so they brought one in and they would tell them, and then they excused them, and then they'd bring another person in and they would tell them. Now, what they want to get is they want to get evidence from eyewitnesses. The high priest can't just go, I don't like what I've been hearing about you, and so we're going to kill you. And the Sanhedrin can't go, we don't like what we're hearing about you, and so we're going to kill you. They have to say, we have 2 witnesses, minimum, whose stories about what you did was exactly the same, and so we believe that what you did based on their testimony is worthy of death, or worthy of whipping, or worthy of, you get what I'm saying? It has to be like this. And the Romans, they don't care about the religious law at all. And so whatever it is that they're going to evidence against Jesus so they could kill him has to be some kind of evidence that makes the Romans go, we need this guy out of the world. He is a problem and we need to kill him. And it's not necessarily that I mean, it's got to be something that makes the Romans nervous about him still being there. And it's what's interesting about this story is even the Romans, when it comes down to it, go, we can't figure out anything that's wrong with this guy. We don't. But they do what they do because they know it's what? Passover, and there are tons of Jews there, and they think that these guys have control over the people, and so they're going to just let this. You see, it's a political moment. It's very political. So can you put that text back up there? We're kind of at a pretty good, we're almost at a good place to stop here, but that's why they say they're trying to find evidence against him so they could kill him. What that means is eyewitnesses. Evidence is eyewitnesses. And it's people who have the exact same stories. And if it's just a slight difference, they have to toss it out. And by the way, you know what the punishment for false testimony was? Punishment for known false testimony was that you got exactly what the accused was going to get if they were found guilty. So you better know what you're talking about before you go in there. And they made you do it right next to the person you were accusing. That's the way it worked. It says, but they couldn't find any. The reason they can't find any is because nobody had any. I mean, they're looking for a blasphemy charge that would say that something that would make the Romans worry that this guy's trying to overthrow some kind of Roman power. And Jesus never said anything about that. And so if they're making it up, he said, and I love the way that and Mark does this. He says, Many false witnesses spoke against him. Like, he declares them false before we even hear what they have to say. He just, they're there, you know, it's like, oh, here come the false witnesses that are going to talk against Jesus. But they contradicted each other. That's exactly what it says. They contradicted each other, but it doesn't even have to be in a very big detail. It could just be one little thing. And they go, I could just see all these guys going, no, get them out. No. What do you say? Repeat that. Oh. Because remember, that it's not so much, the main point is that they got to take something really, really strong to Pilate. Because they can't kill him. They're not going to be able to throw this one off a cliff. Because the people, if the people at that moment heard that, that's why they're doing this at night. Now, there's a lot of talk about the fact that they weren't allowed to have a meeting like this at night. That is not the case. They could meet like this at night if it was a really, really important moment. I'm unsure whether this was important enough to meet that standard. They never punish anybody for false witness. They never do. In the end, we're going to stop right here because it's the next thing with when Caiaphas steps in. He actually does what he's not allowed to do, which is he makes a statement about what he thinks should happen. He gets their approval, but he just takes over. So he's like, I am done with all these witnesses. How much did this cost us? I can hear him saying that. Oh, by the way, witnesses were paid all the time. That was not, I mean, there were people who made a living being false witnesses or being witnesses against people. So, you know, anyway, what a world, huh? I don't know that it's that much different than our court system, but it's like, I just will say this, that they had it figured out. The other thing is that they spent a lot of time debating over what is blasphemy and what is a false witness and what is because they had the law, because there's a whole bunch of stuff in the law. Well, we'll show it next week, but there are bunches of verses that talk about how you convict people and things like that. But then they just have words. The sentence is only about this long, so they're going to just parse it out to the max so they can get it to work for themselves the best way they possibly can. Anyway, are we all okay right here? This is a great place to stop because it's going to shift at this point. But remember, Jesus is just standing there. Oh, he's not up there now, but he's just standing there in the midst of them. Can you imagine how exposed he is? He's exposed, and people are coming, and they're saying things about him that aren't true. One after the other after the other. And he's got no one with him. No one. So, okay. Hey, thanks. I'll see you next week.